the culture has stolen the fundamental ground, and Christians have tried to put the icing of morality on top of a completely different cake. And I think what we're finally seeing is that that thing doesn't hold together very well.
First of all, man, we talked about Christian cohabitation. Is it the new norm? It appears to be statistically, yes. Your thoughts?
That was so man, that is intimidating. And maybe I wasn't as ready as I thought to get to the story. This is a remarkable headline that finally, I guess you could say, the chickens are coming home to roost, both having to do with Christian cohabitation and Christians being okay with premarital sex. And this is statistically what we're seeing. Now, one of the problems with surveys like these is that it's really hard, and sometimes groups like Pew don't give a whole lot of effort to distinguish between people who identify as Christian or identify as evangelical and any sort of indicator of commitment or beliefs or things like that. So you want to keep that kind of in the mix. At the same time, what we have seen during the pandemic is, while the level of commitment was really fragile for an awful lot of people prior to the pandemic, and so that's why church attendance is not quite booming in many places like maybe it could. I know some churches are seeing a great return to normal and some churches aren't. So all of that has to be kind of factored into the mix here. But the key point I was trying to make this week, both on the cohabitation issue and similar statistics which talk about Christians being increasingly okay with sex outside of marriage, is that there has been this backlash largely against purity culture, and purity culture being the bad ways we talked about sex in the early 90s. And it's not really clear what purity culture is. There's a lot of books and a lot of blogs and certainly a lot of Twitter posts talking about how that ruined everything for everyone. I'm not as convinced by that. I mean, there were some terrible things that were done in the name of purity culture, but I'm not sure that that's the worst thing that we can point to. But what happened is, as a reaction to that, churches largely maybe kept mentioning that, what God prefers is sex in context of marriage, but didn't really talk about the other forms of sexuality being, sin, being wrong, not really catechizing why God has preferences, what it has to do with created norms, what it has to do with the way he created humans to be and behave together. And so I think what's happened largely across the board on issues of sexuality, marriage, gender, and so on, is that the culture has stolen the fundamental ground, and Christians have tried to put the icing of morality on top of a completely different cake. And I think what we're finally seeing is that that thing doesn't hold together very well. And so we're seeing the numbers catch up to the reality.
Yeah, and I think there is a connection between all of that and the growing acceptance of LGBTQ ideology among Christians as well, where we've kind of lost our catechism of sex, like you mentioned in the commentary. And once you do that, then other forms of sexual behavior, it seems confusing to suggest
Right.
that that wouldn't be, for the best, or that would go against what sex was for if we've never even talked about what sex was for.
Right.
Then that makes sense that would follow. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't want to drag this story out too much, but there's also this idea that the church has spent far more time, I think, apologizing by and large for all the bad ways we've done it in the past than actually kind of going back to, but it's still right, and this is still right, and this is still wrong, and this is still what, God created sex to be, and this is how it connects with procreation and marriage and culture. And so because that stuff has been largely absent, what I think young people have largely heard is how apologetic the church is for all the bad ways they've done it in the past.
Yeah. With the apologizing thing, too, I think the motive behind it seems to be twofold, with a lot of what I feel like sometimes is over-apologizing for stuff like that. The first motive being we actually have something to apologize for. The second motive being our people won't listen to us unless we say this first. And to that second motive, I will just say I don't think that's borne out in reality. I don't actually think that makes that much of a difference to people, especially when you're talking about doctrine and church leadership. Like, there's a place where if a an individual pastor made a mistake or said something hurtful, to apologize. But to spend so much time apologizing just in the hopes that if I say this, then they'll be ready to listen to me, I don't think that's how humans work. And I think that's a bad idea. Yeah. So we also wrote a commentary this week about the Washington Post publishing an opinion piece calling President Biden a good Catholic. And just referencing, the number of times he attends Mass and how strongly he seems to feel about the Catholic Church in the way he talks about it. But I think we were talking about some concerns we have about his stance on abortion, which is directly in contrast to the teachings of the Catholic Church and Christianity at large.
Yeah, the headline that we were talking about, it was just really kind of interesting that the bishops that had spoken out against President Biden's opinions on abortion, not his candidacy, not his even his role as president or anything like that, but just specifically the fact that he is advancing pro-abortion policies. The headline of the Washington Post was that those Catholic bishops are right-wing and extremist and far-right. That was the sort of language that was used. And Biden is a good Catholic. And I mean, there's so many things that, to talk about as far as that goes, just so bizarre. That first of all, thank you, Washington Post, for once again letting us know what Christians and Catholics and any other people of faith really ought to believe, and also taking this belief that Christians have literally promoted since the first century, that abortion is a taking of an unborn life, that it actually is wrong, that Christians should not be involved in it. And pretending like, Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson have invented it about 30 years ago. It's just it's just wrong. It's historically wrong. Obviously, it's theologically wrong. And, the thing about Catholic bishops is they're probably going to be Catholic. And that means they're going to hold to these things that go historically back and as far back in the church as really you can go.
Those pesky bishops, man. Actually, that is a good segue into another commentary we did this week, just kind of a longer exploration of President Biden's perspective on abortion. So he has scrapped a rule that President Trump put in place. And again, this seems to be one of those things that flops back and forth from president to president. But the federal government does a lot of family planning funding, so sending funds to state and local organizations that say they do family planning. Well, under President Trump, the administration said that this money cannot go to organizations that perform or advocate for abortion as part of family planning because, at least in part, abortion is the opposite of family planning. Well, President Biden has now scrapped that rule, meaning that funds can now go to organizations like Planned Parenthood that say they offer family planning. And I know. So when Trump issued that rule, Planned Parenthood actually said, well, we just won't try to get this funding anymore. Instead of saying, we'll alter the way we do our work, they said we just won't utilize these funds anymore, which was really interesting just in light of the fact that Planned Parenthood tries to say a lot. They'll always trot out this line that's like, abortion is like 3% of what we do or something, which, of course, is a rhetorical shell game. It's a way of writing out a list of the things they supposedly do and then saying that was one line on the list. It would be like us saying our bodies, which we know are like 70% water, but saying water is like 0.1% of what our bodies have because I can write a list of all the other components to it, and that's just one of them. So it's just fake. I mean, abortion is what they do, and that was made clear by them saying we won't go after this funding. If it's only 3% of what you do, stop doing that 3% and take the funding and do the other 97%. But that's clearly their entire business model. Well, now at least we know under President Biden, they'll be eligible to get that fund again.
I think it was to the tune of about $60 million, if I remember the number right. And this is the definition of a political football. We know that there are a lot of these things that are now done at the level of the presidency through executive order and through interpretations of existing legislation, what are typically called rules. And the Trump era rule kind of rolled back that funding and just said, look, you're just not going to get this money from the executive, discretionary budget. If you participate in abortion. It didn't cut funding to Planned Parenthood federally. I mean, the congressional budget still goes at $500 million, so that didn't go anywhere. But your point is well taken, that this does reveal that funding, that if they had to choose between $60 million from the president or abortion funding, they were going to go with abortion funding because the bottom line would be much better. It's also important to note that 3% number comes about when Planned Parenthood, takes someone who's in for an abortion and adds every single thing that they do, like, here's some aspirin and, here's a hospital gown and lay down on this gurney. And when you add all of those things together, then the actual abortion itself, despite all the care that goes into around the act of abortion, then the actual abortion itself is only, that very low number, which is probably still a tough number to get to. But the key point of this particular commentary was simple, is that who's in the White House won't ultimately decide which way abortion goes. It matters, right? Where $60 million is real money, and that's decided by who's in the White House. But and President Trump was the first one to even cut that funding. So there you go. And to implement that rule. But it's just not a long-term rule. And also governing by executive order is not a long-term strategy. So what we need is a cultural shift to continue to work towards the cultural shift that we've already seen on abortion. This is one area where the Democratic Party is out of step with what the American public wants. And so that gives us a lot of ground to run on in protecting unborn life.
Right. And it's not just that we need a cultural shift in terms of should the government pay for abortion, which there has been. I think in the commentary you mentioned that, 3/5 now of Americans don't want the government to pay for abortion, even if they think abortion is okay. That's positive. That's a move in the right direction. But we're not just talking about funding. We need a cultural shift in how we think about abortion in general, that it needs to become, as Abby Johnson and all kinds of people have said, unthinkable to people. Not just a political position that they support or don't support, but it needs to become a touch point that we decide we're just not willing to do anymore. And that's a cultural issue, not an electoral one.